You're in the Waterloop.
Waterloop. Welcome to Waterloop, the nonprofit news outlet exploring solutions for sustainability and equity in water. I'm the host, Travis Loop. This conversation comes to you from the Reservoir Center in Washington, D.C., where Waterloop is the media partner. What if we stopped thinking of infrastructure as just pipes and plants and started seeing it in front yards, parks, and forests? In this episode, I'm joined by Cynthia Koehler, Executive Director of the WaterNow Alliance, to talk about how utilities are embracing distributed, climate-smart water solutions. From turf removal in Colorado to green infrastructure in New Orleans, Cynthia shares how her team helps communities overcome policy, funding, and communication hurdles to get these projects off the ground and scale them up. Before we dive into the episode, I want to thank you, the audience, for making this platform possible. To support Waterloop, subscribe on YouTube, rate and review the podcast on Spotify and Apple, follow us on social media at The Waterloop, and sign up for email updates at waterloop.org. Thanks for being part of the conversation. Waterloop. Cynthia, excited to have a serendipitous opportunity to sit down with you while we're at the Reservoir Center in D.C. For folks that aren't familiar with the WaterNow Alliance, what is your organization?
Thank you for asking, and thanks for inviting me to be on your podcast. We love the Waterloop so much, and so delighted to be here in Washington with you at the Reservoir Center. It's just an incredible facility. So WaterNow Alliance, we are a nonprofit network of water utility leadership nationwide, and our mission is to accelerate and upscale utility investment in climate resilient, environmentally sustainable, and affordable water management strategies that are a little more innovative, a little more outside the box. So what we really focus on is getting utility leaders, really at all levels within the utility, the resources and the tools they need to invest in more distributed systems. So for example, water use efficiency as a source of supply, green stormwater management as an alternative and supplement to tunnels. A lot of things that don't take place on utility property that are not conventional. So we've got projects we're working with utilities to invest in upstream watershed protection as a way of both treating, ensuring source water quality, and even doing some, water, treatment. And then more recently, we've moved into private lead service line replacements, because even though that looks like more conventional infrastructure, the same financing and the same legal challenges that come up when you're looking at these other distributed solutions come up in that space. So a lot of what we do is navigate that policy and that financing and implementing space to help communities really invest in those alternatives at the scale where they're going to provide very significant benefits to communities.
Yeah, I'm curious about that focus on the distributed infrastructure. Why do you see that as a need, as an opportunity?
Well, I think opportunity, it's really more an opportunity. What we all need is high quality drinking water. We need, to be able to treat our wastewater and move it away, and we need to manage our stormwater, right? We need all that functionality that we get, and we've been so well served by conventional water infrastructure, right? And the challenge, though, is that that infrastructure is expensive, it's aging, and as a former water utility director myself for almost 2 decades, I've put my hand in the air and voted for tens of millions of dollars in for conventional water infrastructure, and we need that. The opportunity, though, is to really re-envision our communities as water infrastructure, right? So the more that we have options, the more that we can broaden that portfolio, make more robust that portfolio of infrastructure options for communities, the better off we're going to be really everywhere. Not that every solution works everywhere, but in every community, having a more robust, a more diverse set portfolio of infrastructure options, that's really important, both from an affordability standpoint, but also from a climate resilience standpoint. We're not going to be able to address all of our needs with the solutions of the last couple of centuries. And that's really the opportunity that distributed systems provides.
When you bring up the word communities in that context, I'm thinking also of all the other benefits that these things provide when you're doing them outside of just the water utility, the facilities and the treatment plants, right? When you're doing green infrastructure, when you're doing forest management, whatever it is, there's that whole other host of benefits, and those things cost less, and then they contribute to the water quality and supply, like you said. So,
exactly.
I'm really curious. I've followed you all and been friends for a number of years now. About your accelerator work, and you're really connecting again with communities, with utilities, with cities, and helping them to make progress on a lot of different fronts. Could you talk about it, kind of big picture, what your accelerator is?
So why are we working with communities at all? Why do that? Why not just like go and lobby for things at the state or federal level, which I have done and which can be helpful. But because our mission is all about expanding this universe of, as I said, these robust portfolio of infrastructure options, that only happens if the sector says, that's a good idea, right? You need to reach a tipping point. You need to reach a point where the sector as a whole is saying, we really should move from having green stormwater infrastructure as like little nice to haves that we send third grade groups to go look at on their field trips and really make that central to our stormwater management along with these tunnels. Do you see what I mean?
It's the bell curve of adaptation, right?
That's exactly right.
You got to get that momentum and get to that top and go.
You've got to get to the tipping point. And so our theory, when we were sort of thinking about where do we want to put our limited resources and where do we want to put our strategy is, communities, we need to build a portfolio of community success. We need to be able to show communities that other utilities are doing this, it's worked, we've got the data, right? So that got us into the whole project space, like how are we going to work with communities? And that's what led us to this idea, not very unique, but in particular, meeting communities where they are. So we wanted to flip the model from let us bring something to you bring to us. You tell us what your needs are. We're going to tell you what services we have available, right? We can do policy analysis. We can do data analysis. We can do GIS work. We can work on, policy development. Here's all the things that we can do. And if you have projects, and here's our mission, we're being very transparent, if you want to build a desal plant or a pipeline to Alaska, there's probably other consulting firms to do that for you, right? And they're fantastic. If you're trying to put together, a way to scale up these more distributed, more innovative solutions, but you're running into a barrier. You don't have the staff to design the program, or you can't figure out how to fund it, or you've got a political leader that's skeptical that you can sell that to the public and you need some sort of outreach campaign. That's a place where we can work with you and provide capacity. So the whole idea of the accelerator is to say, we're going to open a round. So we have these rounds depending on our funding and where we are. But we will open an accelerator round. We'll hold it open for, whatever, a month or 6 weeks. And utilities apply. And what we are providing is I think we're doing about 300 pro bono hours of capacity, whatever it is that you need. And it's a competition. So we'll get anywhere from 12 to 36 projects, and people will say, I'm in, wherever in North Carolina, and we've worked in Madison, and we've worked in California and Colorado, and the Philadelphia area. We've really been, around most of the country, and then we'll evaluate those and say, okay, where does it look like we can provide, the biggest benefit? And anyway, we have a number of selection criteria, but anyway, that's the way the accelerator works. Is we sort of open around, utilities apply, and then once we get underway, we put together a work plan, and we have a defined amount of time and a defined level of effort where we'll be engaging.
It's interesting because you see a lot of accelerator type models around technology, right, or startups and businesses, right? Like to help them with their work and their project and get them over and get to a tipping point where something can be commercialized or whatever. Exactly. But not a lot of that same kind of help for, the less sexy municipal water utilities out there that could use some of the same, oomph. What are a couple maybe of your favorites that you've worked on?
For the accelerators?
Yeah, a couple projects maybe that you've worked on.
Let me think about that, because we've really had a lot of really fun things. We worked with Golden, Colorado, a number of years ago, and we helped them put together the first Graywater ordinance in the state. So that was interesting.
That's huge, too,
yeah,
right?
Exactly, exactly. And part of what we had to deal with to navigate there was, and this is the interesting thing always about, especially we tend to focus more on public utilities, primarily because there are more of them, and because the challenges that they face on financing are particularly complicated. So we've made, WaterNow has a particular area of expertise around financing for public water utilities, because I'm not directly answering your question. I'll get to it, though. Yeah. One of the biggest challenges in doing distributed infrastructure is how do you pay for it? Because there is a long-standing view that utilities can absolutely go out and bond finance. They can build their reservoirs and their treatment plants and your pipes and your tanks and buy your trucks or whatever, and you can use your bond financing to do that. The feeling about your water use efficiency programs or money that you're going to spend upstream, protecting watersheds, well, now we've got to go find a grant, or maybe we're going to spend a little bit of our operating funds, but we absolutely cannot dip into capital. Well, that is completely wrong, and you absolutely can dip into capital. And it's kind of a motivating precept for us, because the way to get to scale is to spend. You need to be able to invest in those distributed systems in the same way. Sorry, something's going on here. There we go. And you need to be able to invest in those distributed systems in the same way that you'd invest in your other infrastructure alternatives, right? So we've spent a lot of time thinking about that. So that brings me back to, so what are some of our favorite projects? So working with the public utilities, what happens is you'll be in the middle of a project and the city council will change, or the utility board will change, and suddenly people are like, what is this project and what are we doing? So we have become very nimble, and we've become, I would say, very adept at speaking to people, again, where they are. Not everybody uses the same language for everything, and we have learned to be multilingual so that we can relate to all of the different views that are brought to bear. So to get back, so Golden was a great project. I loved working, and we're still working with New Orleans. New Orleans came to us a number of years ago, and I don't know if you know, but obviously they have very significant stormwater runoff issues. And they came with a very ambitious idea, which is they wanted all of their public works to bring to bear this idea that all of our public infrastructure is going to be green infrastructure, right? All of their streets, all of their parks, all of their parking lots, all of this, and they came to us and said, we're just trying to think through, where to start. And we looked at some things and we said, we think we need to do an audit of your current municipal code, because just a quick look made us realize that the idea of capturing water and letting it percolate was not what the city had done in the past. So my team found 70 ordinances that would have been completely in conflict with what they wanted to do. So we put together a roadmap of how they could start revamping their municipal code to make it, because the last thing you want is to tell a city, oh, here's a solution, and then they implement it and it's in conflict. Exactly. Yeah. So we basically put together a roadmap about all of the different ways in which their municipal code would need to be altered. So now, to get back to the unsexy thing, there's very little that's less sexy than municipal codes. Rewriting municipal codes. Yeah. But very essential, and it's the kind of thing that I love because it enables a much bigger solution, right?
And now you see New Orleans charging ahead on that green infrastructure in public and private space. That is an overriding focus.
They are. And the other great thing about the accelerator model is, maybe we'll come in and do this little project. It's also not intimidating, right? Because there's anxiety. I think more and more utilities are partnering with NGOs like WaterNow, but some are nervous. It's like, we're the experts, and they are, right? And there's reasons to be careful and make sure that you're partnering. So what the accelerator allows us to do is we're sort of dating, right? We're not committing. We're having a little, as the kids say, a situationship. And it's it's very it's very defined. We're going to do this project. It's going to take this long. But I would say in most
no big
cases,
commitment here.
No big commitments. No, definitely not. But what it does is allow us to learn one another, right? Yeah. We are able to learn, and this is important. I mean, they're able to learn that we're trustworthy, that we know what we're doing, that we are providing them with solid information. We're listening to them and providing, filling whatever gap they need, and we're listening to them, because not every situationship moves on to the next level, right? And sometimes we work with communities and there's been a shift or whatever, and they're not as engaged as we thought they would be. And so it's like, fine, we've done what we can, now we're all moving on. But most of the time, what happens is that there's a level of confidence and a relationship that grows. For the most part, these are seeded relationships that have led to more intentional and long-lasting engagements. So, for example, we continue to be involved in New Orleans, even though we finished that project I want to say 4 or 5 years ago, and now we're working with them to help them put together a stormwater fee, so that they can really bring the funds in that they need to do the green stormwater work that they want to do.
Well, that's interesting, talking about how a utility is hesitant to have an organization, an NGO, come in. We're the experts, we know what's going on, but they clearly forever have relied on engineering firms, technology companies, other providers to come in and tell them how to do things or whatever, enable them to do it. But now as they're looking beyond that traditional infrastructure, they need to look beyond the traditional consultants, right? And get the other experts in. Very cool. Yeah. Any other favorite accelerator example?
Another part of our, kind of our evolution is realizing that, affordability has always been one of our, fundamental, pillars that we work on. And as we've gotten, particularly in the West, more involved with utilities that are trying to move forward with efficiency projects, what has come forward, and this is what's great about the accelerator model, Travis, because, we don't think of everything, you know what I mean? So, and the communities are like, well, we have, it's happened to us in 2 different parts of California where completely unrelated, 2 communities came to us and said, we have very significant Spanish-speaking populations, and in another it was Mandarin, and they had done their own research to realize that they were not having the engagement of those communities in the way that they were having the engagement of native English speakers in their communities, and they're like, this is a big problem because these are very, very significant subpopulations, and they're like, this is not what we do. We're a water utility. What should we do? So we put together a team. We brought in, sort of our own, folks who are, we have, a lot of people who work on, outreach and communications. But then we also brought in, some additional outside expertise, since none of us speak Mandarin, to really think through, like, how are we going to connect with those communities? And some of it is as simple as, maybe do the bills in Mandarin and in Spanish. But some of it is overcoming a lack of trust that non-native English-speaking communities have. So a lot of what we put together in both of those places were similar strategies, but very different execution. So, go to these festivals, go to these stores, go to these, it was a lot of asking the utility to get a little outside of its comfort by doing a very different kind of outreach than they've done in the past. They were going to be good at translating bills into different languages, doing door hangers, that kind of thing. And we're saying, when you have a trust issue, you need to make a different level of effort.
That human-to-human contact, in a way.
Exactly. Yeah. And we encouraged involvement with those NGOs in those communities, right? Like, we are aware of our sphere, right? And having WaterNow, walk into, whatever those communities are, that's not what they needed. They needed us to help them design the program. But the other thing we did is we made the connections with some of the local on-the-ground frontline communities, that are trusted, that are already engaged, that are already in a liaison relationship, and brought them in. And that's always, I have to say, very satisfying, right? Because these are groups that are not working on water. Sure. That's not what they're doing. Yeah. But they were delighted to, to be respected, for their role to be acknowledged, and, to bring them in and let them be leaders in making this connection between the utility and the affected community.
I love that. That's awesome. Yeah. I noticed that so much of your accelerator work, or you have a special focus or a special relationship in the state of Colorado. Yeah. You really have a lot going on there. Why has that come about, and what's happening in that state?
Well, I'll tell you, there's a lot of interesting things happening in Colorado. We've got 10 folks at WaterNow, and 4 of us are in the Denver Boulder area. So it's really where we have a lot of growth in our organization. We also have 2 people in Pennsylvania, so we can talk about that later. But what's really happening in Colorado is that it is, it's growing. It's growing, and it is. There are a lot of local leaders that are realizing that it's water constrained. The Colorado River is, of course, in the news constantly for the various pressures. And so the interest in water use efficiency in particular, but also in upstream watershed health. The Colorado obviously has had devastating fires that has severely impacted utilities. So there's various drivers that are leading local leaders to already be thinking a little bit beyond, or a lot beyond, conventional infrastructure. Sure. So that's part of what's happening there. But what also is happening is that we've been there for a while, right? I mean, Colorado was the first state we went to after California. And we began doing a few accelerator projects there, mainly around water use efficiency, and then it grew. So what we came up with a few years ago, I now have a Colorado Basin Program Director based in Boulder, and we came up with the idea of a Project Accelerator cohort for Colorado, so that we are not just working with Broomfield or Greeley or Westminster, but we're actually bringing them together. Because even though those communities each have different leaders and different personalities and slightly different problems, there's a lot of overlap in what they're trying to do. So for example, we've actually just finished a large project on replacing turf. And turf is, it's the low-hanging fruit, right? I mean, in Colorado, it's about 40% of the state's drinking water.
And when we say turf, we're talking about the grass that people put in their yards or at businesses or whatever it is that doesn't belong there, right? Like it's that grass that is meant to grow in the east of the U.S., but they grow it in the West because it's green and looks pretty, and it takes a lot of water.
So much water, and it's non-native. And to be clear, a lot of our focus is on, this is sort of one of these wonky, industry jargon terms, is non-essential turf, right? Yeah. So, if you have kids, my boys played in the grass. I mean, if you're going to have a lawn in your backyard, you have a lawn in your backyard, it's fine. That's not considered non-essential. The non-essential turf is really ornamental, that nobody uses. Kind of the
median of the highway.
The medians, exactly. And if you've got a front lawn and nobody's using it, right? I mean, it's. I heard somebody say once, if you've got a lawn and nobody has walked on it for a year, that's non-essential turf. So a lot of the focus has been on that idea of what can we do with non-essential turf, because the idea isn't to pave over everything, especially from a climate perspective. You want to have green growing things, but there are huge, tremendous options with native plantings, whether it's grasses or trees or bushes or whatever. Natives are a fantastic option.
And still have that permeability.
Exactly, as well as the cooling impact. So a lot of our work in Colorado has been, how to help communities really begin thinking through what that transition looks like, because and this is where the issue of scale comes up, right? Because the opportunity on outdoor watering is just enormous. So like I said, it's about 40% in Colorado, and in other places that have already invested in turf changeouts, we've seen huge impacts. You're looking at really permanent reductions in demand. So Southern Nevada Water Agency in Las Vegas, for example, they've been investing in turf changeout for a long time. They've saved the equivalent of, I believe it's about a little more than 460,000 acre feet. That's an annual number, right? Yeah. So that is a reservoir.
And like you said, that's a full reservoir of water.
Does it take investment? Yes. You have to think about, that's the big mind shift, is thinking about not using water as supply. And that is I believe that's coming in the water industry, but it will take some time.
And they've had to do some things like you mentioned. They've had to change some codes and pass some laws, and then also spend money to incentivize homeowners. And Absolutely. So it's a multifaceted effort, like a lot of these distributed solutions are.
They are, yeah. So a lot of our work is helping those communities to set up pilots, because that's the other thing. As I mentioned, there's this lack of data. So you have people that are skeptical. It's like, well, if we invest all this money in not selling water, what is that going to get us? So we set up, performance metrics, and and then help design the program and help really figure out, like, well, how much are we going to have to invest? If you give people $100 to change out their turf, they're probably not going to do very much, right? And if you give them $10,000 to do it, is that costing you too much? Right. Does that make sense? So a lot of what we do is work with these communities to find, that sweet spot and really work through those technical details and set up the pilot. How long should it last? That kind of thing. And then you and I were talking earlier, well, if you're going to do a pilot, you really are going to need to have landscapers who can do it. So, so that's another piece, so we work on some training programs to make sure that you've got, water efficient, qualified water efficient landscapers, and you need nurseries to be able to sell those things. So it is a community-wide transformation, so it takes time.
One of the things you mentioned is fires, right, and the challenge that these pose for communities in Colorado, California, Absolutely. And how even water utilities have to be thinking about what's upstream, what's uphill, right? What's up forest. A lot of places are even very very close to wild areas, and so what's that interface look like?
That is exciting. So more and more utilities are. Look, utility managers are in some ways the best environmental stewards out there, right? Because, while the general public, at my utility, we surveyed folks a number of years ago, do you know where your water comes from? And they're like, from the faucet. But utility managers are fully aware that their water is coming from, some forested area, some river up the road, wherever it is. And, depending on your particular situation, more and more utilities are realizing that rather than building, and now you're getting into the wastewater piece as well, that rather than building, a tertiary treatment plant, to deal with, all of the runoff and this and that, maybe if we invest more upfront in our water, in our source water, and keep our supply, better, more healthy, so that you're not getting runoff in that same way. We are finishing up a project in Colorado that's very exciting. The U.S. Forest Service, and I thought this was very forward-looking of them. Their mandate is not to manage the forest for downstream water use, right? Their mandate is to manage the forest for forest use, right, and logging or whatever. But the relationship between Denver Water in particular and the upstream forest has really come into, very sharp relief with fires, a couple decades ago, destruction of infrastructure, enormous amounts of debris. So there's been an interest, and Denver Water has this great forest to faucet, I think that's what it's called, forest to faucet program. And so building on that, we've done this work now with the U.S. Forest Service to encourage downstream cities to invest in upstream watershed protection measures, right? Because the Forest Service only has so many resources. And it's really all about making that financial case, right? That if as a downstream, water receiver, it makes sense for you to be investing in the health of this resource that's, hundreds of miles away, because it is going to cost you much less over time.
An ounce of prevention, pound of cure.
Yeah, and it's a tough argument to make to political decision makers, right? I mean, you're in office for 4 years, 8 years, maybe 12, but I mean, it's hard to look, beyond, well, I'm going to raise rates today to do that kind of thing. So, that is very exciting, and I think that is going to be a trend. We're seeing more and more utilities. You're seeing it in Arkansas, in New York, Utah, really all over. There's more and more activity around. What do we need to be doing to keeping our source water protection in place and and growing, and then you've got a whole communication issue with your public. You've got to bring your public in on that. Yeah. So maybe I'll leave you with that. I think that's another piece of our work that I'm excited about that is rarely its own project, but it's often part and parcel of our projects, and that is how the heck do we communicate this to our public? Like, because we have as an industry taught people that water should be cheap, and on some level it should be, right? It's basic, it's fundamental. Like, there's no life without water. So it should not be something that we should all be able to afford water. At the same time, the need for the public to understand what's involved in getting water from where it is to where it needs to go is essential, because you need that partnership. You need the public to understand that if their rates are going up, it is because this vast infrastructure is necessary to bring them the water they need. I'll end with one more story from when I was on a board, and we weren't raising rates very much. I want to say it was a 5 or 6%, but there were some people who were upset about it, and there was a big public meeting, and everybody was yelling, and it's very late at night, and finally somebody stands up and says, just very angry, water is falling from the sky for free. It shouldn't cost anything. It should be free. It falls from the sky for free. And the whole room is cheering. Yay, that's fantastic. And by this time, I was being a little less politic than I should have been. And I leaned into my microphone and I said, it doesn't fall from the sky into your bathtub. And I think that is sometimes what people miss, and and I think that's on us as an industry.
It's an ongoing challenge.
We need to bring that public along and really help them understand what it takes.
Well, I'm just glad that realization is really at the forefront of the water industry right now. They realize that we've got to be telling those stories.
That's right. That is the benefit of podcasts like yours, to really bring the public in.
There you go. Cynthia, thank you so much. Good to talk to you.
Always great to talk with you, Travis.
Thanks for listening. If you want to support Waterloop's ongoing exploration of water solutions, subscribe on YouTube, rate and review the podcast on Spotify and Apple, follow us on social media at The Waterloop, and sign up for email updates at waterloop.org. Until next time, be water, my friends.
You're in the Waterloop.